longer persist. My name is Janet, and if you'd met me a few years ago, you'd have said I was the epitome of a happy, lucky woman. The beginning was like a fairy tale. If you'd looked up perfect wedding in a dictionary, you'd find our names there. Larry, I can't believe we're getting married today. It's everything I've ever dreamed of, I whispered to him as we posed for pictures in our luxurious garden venue, surrounded by blooming roses and peonies. The petals seemed to blush in response to our happiness. I know, Janet. You make me the happiest man on earth, he replied, his eyes twinkling as if they held the secrets of the universe. Larry was good with words. He knew just what to say to make me feel like a queen. And I truly felt like one on that day, donning a gown so magnificent that even Cinderella would be jealous. Our guests were a mix of socialites, business moguls, and close family members, all impeccably dressed, complementing the luxurious setting. A 5-tier cake stood at the center of the venue, adorned with intricate sugar flowers that mirrored the live floral decorations. Strings of lights were strewn across the trees, making the evening magical as we danced under the stars to the soft melodies of a live orchestra. So, how does it feel to be Mrs. Larry? One of my bridesmaids, Sarah, asked me during the reception, her eyes shining with excitement. It feels like I'm living in a dream, Sarah. Just look at this place. Look at Larry. Everything is perfect, I gushed, looking over at Larry, who was talking animatedly with some colleagues. Oh, girl, you hit the jackpot. A wealthy, handsome man who loves you. What more could you ask for? Sarah giggled, toasting her champagne glass against mine. Absolutely nothing, I said, convinced that I had indeed reached the pinnacle of happiness. Little did I know, it was the calm before the storm. Our wedding planner outdid herself. Everything ran smoothly. The food was exquisite, featuring a gourmet 5-course meal that left our guests raving for weeks. The band played all our favorite tunes, and we shared the most passionate kiss as we were announced husband and wife. Our vows were personal and heartfelt, mirroring our love and the future we envisioned. Larry, today I become your wife, your partner, your biggest supporter. I vow to stand by you through every high and low and to build a loving home filled with joy, respect, and endless love. I professed, trying hard to fight back tears of joy. And Janet, today I take you as my partner in crime, my other half, my better half. I promise to love you, to provide for you, and to cherish you every day for the rest of our lives, he replied, sealing his vows with a tender kiss. The crowd erupted into applause, as if approving our union and the life we were set to embark upon. That day, the world was in the palm of our hands, and our love felt invincible. The warning signs were there, subtle but noticeable. I just didn't want to see them. Caught in the beauty of my ivory tower, a tower that would eventually crumble, turning my dream into a never-ending nightmare. But that's a tale for another chapter. At that moment, life was a blossoming garden, and I was a flower at the peak of its bloom, unaware that seasons change, and even the most beautiful flowers can wither away. After the wedding, we moved into a spacious, modern house with an open floor plan, nestled in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. Larry's job was demanding but lucrative. As a high-ranking executive in a Fortune 500 company, he was often away for business trips. During those early days, I immersed myself in decorating our home and imagining the life we'd share. When Larry was home, though, his temper would often flare, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. At first, I chalked it up to stress. He was a businessman with significant responsibilities, after all. It was a terrible meeting, Janet. The audacity of some people. Larry would rant, pacing around our living room like a caged lion. His nostrils flared and his fists clenched. It's okay, Larry. Sit down. Relax. Let me make you a drink I'd suggest attempting to be the calm amidst his storm. And just like that, the tension would evaporate, and he'd be the charming man I married once again. "You always know how to make things better," he'd say, his eyes softening. It was those moments of tenderness that made me overlook the red flags. I told myself that every relationship had its challenges and that ours was strong enough to withstand them. When I became pregnant, it felt like a blessing. Larry seemed overjoyed, kissing my belly and talking to it as if our unborn child could understand him. "You're going to be a great kid, you hear me? Your mom and I are going to give you everything you ever need." My pregnancy was an opportunity for me to retreat further into the domestic sphere, focusing on our coming bundle of joy. I painted the nursery, read all the books about parenting I could get my hands on, and even started attending prenatal classes. Larry's occasional bursts of anger persisted, but they seemed less significant in the context of our expanding family. Or so I told myself. "We need to get the best for our child," Larry said one day as we browsed through an upscale baby store. His eyes widened at the prices, but he didn't hesitate. "Get that stroller, the one with all the features. Money is no object when it comes to our family." And yet, as my belly grew, so did the tension. Larry began working late more often, using his job as an excuse to avoid spending time at home. I tried to tell myself that he was just stressed about becoming a father, but the little voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was wrong. A hidden fissure was growing in the foundation of our seemingly perfect life. "Larry, you've been coming home late, a lot. Is everything okay?" I asked one evening as he trudged through the front door past midnight, looking drained. "It's just work, Janet. High-stakes projects, lots of pressure. You wouldn't understand," he snapped, his words slicing through the air like a cold blade. "Okay, if you say so," I responded, swallowing the lump that had formed in my throat. I busied myself with chores and baby preparations, avoiding the nagging sense that something darker was going on. It was during this period that the true nature of our relationship began to reveal itself, like a mirror cracking to show a distorted reflection. I still clung to the memories of our wedding and the promise of a family, ignoring the signs that the man I had married was not the man standing before me. Each outburst, each cold shoulder, each disdainful remark, they were all fractures that foreshadowed the shattering of my life, my family, and my self-worth. But sometimes the most significant disasters are those you never see coming, even when the signs are right in front of you. Months rolled on, and the impending birth of our child brought a mix of joy and uncertainty. I spent my days preparing for the new life we would welcome, but beneath the surface, I was gripped by an increasing sense of dread. My mind would often wander to Larry's frequent outbursts, his impatient snipes, and the thinly veiled aggression. The pantry ran bare one day. This wouldn't usually be a big deal, simply a matter of going shopping, but for some reason the emptiness of the shelves felt like a reflection of the growing void in our relationship. I checked my purse, realizing I had left my wallet in our bedroom, which was currently a makeshift home office for Larry. Not wanting to disturb him, I decided to take $50 from his wallet lying on the kitchen counter. It was for groceries, after all. Surely he'd understand. Larry returned home later that evening, and the atmosphere was different. I could feel the tension in the air, a storm brewing. He went to the kitchen counter, leafed through his wallet, and his face turned an alarming shade of red. "Janet, did you take money from my wallet?" His voice was dangerously low. "I did," I admitted, clinging to the naive hope that honesty would defuse the situation. "I needed to get groceries, and I didn't want to disturb you while you were working." His response came in a vehement burst. "You think you can just take money out of my wallet like a beggar? Without asking?" "I needed to buy food for us. I thought you'd want me to take care of the home," I stammered, feeling the walls close in on me. His eyes narrowed. "You're nothing more than a beggar janitor in this house." And then, before I had time to even process his words, his hand struck my face. The force of the slap threw me off balance. I screamed as I tumbled to the ground, clutching my belly, feeling an acute, piercing pain. It was as though a switch flipped in Larry. His face paled, realizing the gravity of what he had done. He hurriedly dialed 911, shouting into the phone, "I need an ambulance. My wife fell, and she's pregnant." The ambulance arrived, its siren wailing like a mournful cry, echoing my own agony. Larry paced around, muttering, "Oh God, what have I done? What have I done?" The paramedics lifted me onto a stretcher, their faces masks of professional concern. As I was rushed to the hospital, every bump in the road sent a jolt of pain through me. I knew something was terribly wrong, but nothing could prepare me for the soul-crushing weight of the loss I was about to endure. It was too late. By the time we reached the hospital, the worst had already happened. Despite the medics' best efforts and Larry's hollow apologies, I miscarried. Our unborn child, the life we were so eager to welcome into the world, was gone. Just like that. As I lay in the hospital bed afterward, it hit me. Larry was the root of this unspeakable tragedy. This was no accident. It was the result of his unchecked anger, his cruel arrogance, his utter failure as a husband and as a soon-to-be father. The breaking point had arrived, tearing apart the last fragile threads holding our marriage together. From that moment on, the path forward was a one-way street, and it was one I would walk alone, fueled by a newfound, burning desire for justice. A few days later, I was discharged from the hospital. Each step I took felt like I was walking on shards of broken glass, my heart and body irreparably damaged. But even then, I knew I had to keep moving. I knew I had to keep moving. I couldn't afford to stand still. Larry came to pick me up, a bouquet of flowers in his hands. The sight of him made my stomach churn. The flowers seemed like a cruel joke, as if a bunch of petals could somehow mend what was shattered. "I'm so sorry, Janet," Larry stammered as he helped me into the car. His eyes never met mine, as if he were afraid of what he would see. "Don't," I said, cutting him off. "Just don't." The car ride home was a journey through a psychological minefield. Each moment stretched longer than the last, every street corner and traffic light a reminder of a life that had veered horrifically off track. When we got home, Larry started talking again, his voice tinged with desperation. "Janet, I know I messed up. I can't change the past, but I can try to make it right. Can we please?" "I want a divorce," I interjected, the words coming out more calmly than I had anticipated. "And I want you out of this house." He looked like he had been slapped. "Janet, please, You've done enough," I said. "Now it's my turn to take control." Within hours, I had packed a bag and called a cab. The destination, my mother's house. I couldn't bear to stay another second in the home that had become my prison. My mother was shocked when she saw me, her eyes filling with tears as she took in my emotional and physical state. "Mom, I need your help," I began, choking back my tears as I recounted the horrifying events that had unfolded. She listened, her eyes widening with every detail, her arms trembling but resolute around me. "We will get through this," she said when I had finished, "and he will pay for what he has done." Though a lawyer by training, I had never imagined that my skills would be employed in such a personal, agonizing battle. But life has a way of laughing at your plans. Over the next 2 weeks, I submerged myself in law books, case studies, and legal forms, preparing my lawsuit against Larry. Mom was by my side the whole time, a rock of emotional support. The day I filed the suit felt like the first day of the rest of my life. Each word I typed, each document I submitted was a step away from the nightmare I had lived and a step closer to justice. Larry was served with the papers a few days later. "I can't believe you're doing this," he spat when he called me, the audacity of his disbelief almost making me laugh. "You better believe it," I responded before hanging up. There was nothing left to say. This was my breaking away, not just from a toxic relationship, but from a version of myself that had been stifled, degraded, and damaged. I wasn't just filing legal papers. I was reclaiming my dignity, my freedom, and my future. It was terrifying, yet invigorating. For the first time in a long time, I felt powerful, like I was in the driver's seat of my own life. and as I clicked the final submit button on my lawsuit, a sense of grim satisfaction washed over me. Larry had taken something irreplaceable from me, and while nothing could bring it back, I could at least take everything from him. This was my declaration of independence, my point of no return. And come what may, I was ready for the battle that lay ahead. The courthouse was imposing, a monolith of stone and steel that had been witness to countless human dramas. As I walked through its doors, briefcase in hand, I couldn't shake off the weight of what lay ahead. Larry was already there, accompanied by his lawyer, looking unusually reserved. Our eyes met briefly, but I averted my gaze. He was a stranger to me now, an adversary in a battle he had himself incited. "Janet, this is your final call. We can still settle this outside of court." Larry's lawyer approached me, his voice oozing folk sympathy. "We could have," I said, locking eyes with him, "but that time has passed." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with a mix of anticipation and tension. The judge entered, a stern-faced woman with an air of solemnity. We all rose, and as I sat back down, I looked around. There were a few familiar faces, close friends, some distant family members, but mostly it was a room full of strangers, all waiting to witness the dissolution of a life I had once been so sure of. The trial commenced. Larry's lawyer was good, building a narrative that portrayed Larry as a loving, caring husband who had had a momentary lapse in judgment, an aberration that shouldn't define his life. When it was my turn, my lawyer, actually a close friend from law school, presented the facts, but more importantly, she humanized me, shifting the focus from Larry's momentary lapse to the irrevocable loss and suffering he had inflicted upon me. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are not here to examine a momentary lapse. We are here because a woman's life was ruined and a child was lost," she said, her voice tinged with a subdued yet palpable anger. Then came the testimonies, a parade of witnesses narrating their perception of our life. Friends, neighbors, even the paramedics who had rushed me to the hospital, they all painted a consistent picture. Larry was aggressive and domineering. I had lived under an unspoken regime of fear. I took the stand, and under oath, I told my story. But I made a calculated choice. I slightly altered the medical records, emphasizing the direct correlation between Larry's violence and the loss of our unborn child. It was a risky move, but the stakes were too high, and I needed every advantage I could get. "So you're saying that the defendant's actions directly led to your miscarriage?" the prosecuting attorney asked. "Absolutely," I answered, my voice unwavering. "The medical reports and the timing of the incident make that clear." Larry's face turned a deep shade of red, but he was helpless, his past actions having brought him to this unenviable present. After the closing statements, the jury retreated for deliberation. The wait was agonizing, each tick of the clock amplifying the gravity of the impending verdict. Finally, they returned. The courtroom hushed into an expectant silence as the foreperson stood to read the verdict. "We find the defendant, Larry, guilty of inflicting particularly serious bodily harm and emotional distress." A collective gasp filled the room. Larry's face contorted in disbelief, while a wave of relief washed over me. The judge then ruled in favor of dividing his assets, half of which would go to me, and sentenced him to prison. As I stepped out of the courtroom, the victory felt bittersweet. While justice was served, it came at the cost of a life, a family, a future that would never be. Yet, as I walked away from that chapter of my life, I felt my spine straighten and my step lighten. Larry had taken something precious from me, but in return, I had taken everything from him. It was the only form of justice that made sense to me now, a cold but necessary end to a tragic tale. My legal battle was over, but my personal journey towards healing was just beginning, and this time I would be walking that path on my own terms. The sun was shining brighter than usual. The day I walked out of the courthouse, the clouds that had shrouded my life for so long seemed to have dispersed, as if in deference to the justice that had been served. But even amid this newfound clarity, I knew there was a long road ahead filled with its own set of challenges and trials. Vindication in the eyes of the law was one thing. Personal vindication was another, more intricate battle. I returned to my mother's house, where she had prepared a small celebratory lunch. It was a simple affair, just the two of us. But in that simplicity lay the beauty of unconditional love and support. "Janet, I'm so proud of you," my mom said as we sat down to eat. "It's hard to stand up for yourself, especially against someone you once loved." "It had to be done, Mom," I replied, my voice tinged with a mixture of relief and sadness. If not for me, then for the unborn child who will never get a chance to see the world. A few days after the trial, I received a call from Larry's sister, Emily. We had been close once, and the events that transpired had put an awkward strain on our relationship. "Janet, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for what my brother did to you," Emily stuttered, her voice tinged with genuine sorrow. "I know sorry doesn't change anything, but I had to say it." "Thank you, Emily," I replied, pausing to find the right words. "I appreciate your compassion, but this is a path Larry chose for himself." "I understand," she said before hanging up. It was a brief conversation, but one that closed a lingering chapter, allowing me to move on without the burden of what, ifs and could have, beens. In the weeks that followed, I began putting my life back together. I reactivated my law license and started accepting cases again. I moved into a new apartment, smaller than the house I'd shared with Larry, but infinitely more peaceful. Each box I unpacked, each painting I hung up on the wall felt like an assertion of my newfound.
My name is Sophia, and like every little girl, I'd dreamt of a fairy tale wedding for as long as I could remember. The man I chose to spend my life with, Mark, seemed like a dream come true. He was a mechanical engineer, witty and kind-hearted. I was head over heels in love and saw my life unfolding like the storybooks said it would. Little did I know that my fairy tale would take a darker turn, starting on the very day meant to celebrate our love. Mark's parents, Jane and Roger, were traditionalists. They liked to keep things old-fashioned, which wasn't a problem in itself. The problem was that they had opinions on everything, opinions they weren't shy about sharing. I was keen to make a good impression, but it seemed like the more I tried, the worse things got. The wedding ceremony was beautiful, set in an old cathedral with towering arches and intricate stained glass windows. I was getting ready in the bridal suite, nervous butterflies in my stomach, when Jane and Roger walked in uninvited. Jane eyed me up and down, and I saw her lips curl into a judgmental sneer. "Is this the best you could do?" she asked, gesturing at my wedding gown. "That dress makes you look chunky." I felt like someone had slapped me. I looked at Mark for support, but he uncomfortably shifted his gaze to the floor. "It's her day, Mom. Let her enjoy it," he finally muttered, clearly unwilling to challenge her more forcefully. Jane huffed. "Fine, but remember you're marrying into this family. There are standards to uphold." Roger decided to weigh in. "We've always had tasteful weddings in this family. I hope you know how to keep a house better than you plan a wedding." "Enough, Dad," Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. It was as though they had sucked the joy right out of him. At that moment, I wanted to cry, but I took a deep breath, plastering a smile on my face. "Thank you for your input," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "I hope the rest of the day meets your standards." As they left, Jane threw one final jab. "We'll see! The bar's pretty high." The ceremony proceeded, but the atmosphere was tense. When I walked down the aisle, I saw mixed expressions. Friends and family smiling warmly, while Jane and Roger looked on with barely veiled disdain. Every time our eyes met, I felt a shiver down my spine, as if they were dissecting me, judging my worthiness to be part of their family. Yet for the sake of Mark and the love I thought we shared, I pushed through it. The reception was another battleground. Jane and Roger critiqued every detail, my choice of flowers, the menu, even the music. They mingled with the guests, spreading their thinly veiled insults like wildfire. "So you're the lucky bride." One of Mark's aunts approached me, her tone condescending. "Jane told me you planned this all by yourself. Brave girl." In that moment, I started to realize that the dream wedding I had envisioned was turning into a nightmare. And this was just the beginning. I looked at Mark, who seemed trapped between his loyalty to his family and his love for me. In that moment, I realized that my fairy tale was laced with dark undertones I had not seen before. As the night drew to a close, I tried to focus on the happy parts. The way Mark looked at me when we exchanged vows, the cheer from friends who genuinely loved us. But it was impossible to shake off the sense of foreboding. I went home that night as Mrs. Sophia Harper, blissfully in love, and yet, at the same time, painfully aware that the family I had married into would be anything but a fairy tale. It was my first inkling that I had just stepped into a life that was going to test me in ways I could never have imagined. But as they say, forewarned is forearmed, and the experiences that lay ahead would steel me for the battles to come. We moved into Mark's parents' house right after the honeymoon, a beautiful European getaway that briefly made me forget the ugly scenes that unfolded at our wedding. But the second we crossed the threshold of what was supposed to be my new home, it felt like we'd entered a realm where love and empathy no longer existed. It was a spacious, 4-bedroom house with plush furnishings and carefully chosen decor, but it might as well have been a prison cell. The first night there, as I unpacked my things, Mark's mother, Jane, walked into the room with her eyes narrowed. "Sophia, where are you planning to put all of these things?" she questioned, poking through my carefully chosen trinkets. "In our bedroom, of course," I answered, somewhat confused by the inquiry. Jane sighed dramatically. "Your clutter will simply ruin the aesthetic of the house. Maybe put them in the basement." Hurt and bewildered, I decided to choose my battles and agreed. "All right, Jane, if it bothers you, I'll put them in the basement." A smug smile curled her lips. "Good, I'm glad you understand." As if on cue, Roger, Mark's father, walked in with a list in his hand. "Here's a list of chores you'll need to take care of daily. We're not running a hotel here." Stunned, I glanced at Mark, who seemed to sink into himself, trying to make himself smaller. "Dad, she's not here to be your housekeeper. She also has a job, you know?" Roger glared at Mark. Having a job doesn't exempt her from contributing to the household. In this family, we believe in equal responsibilities. "Equal," I choked out the word. "Jane doesn't work, and yet I'm the one given a list of chores." Jane sniffed. "I manage this household, which is a full-time job. You'll learn." Days turned into weeks, and each day became an endurance test. I was entrusted with cooking, cleaning, laundry, and grocery shopping, all while holding a 9-to-5 job as a marketing executive. My professional life was excelling, but at home I felt like Cinderella, minus the fairy godmother. During dinner one night, the tension reached a boiling point. I'd prepared a roast, careful to follow a recipe I found online to make sure it would meet the high standards Jane and Roger seemed to uphold. Roger took one bite and frowned. "Look at this, the meat is overcooked. It's like chewing rubber." Jane chimed in, "Sophia, cooking takes practice. Obviously, you haven't had much." Frustrated, I looked at Mark, silently begging him to intervene. Finally, he spoke up, but it wasn't the defense I was hoping for. "Mom, Dad, she's doing her best. Sophia, maybe you could use some cooking classes." My heart sank. There was no alliance here, no partnership where I felt supported. I was alone in a household that saw me not as a family member, but as an outsider who needed to prove her worth to earn her place by their harsh standards. That night, as I lay in bed next to Mark, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of dread. I had willingly entered this house, naively believing love would be enough to get us through. But in this home, love was conditional, expectations were skewed, and I was the one who had to bear the brunt of it. And so, I resolved that something had to change, either in this house or in my life. I couldn't go on like this, losing pieces of myself each day. But little did I know, things would get worse before they got better. The nightmare was only just beginning. After another grueling year at the house from hell, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. Through sheer hard work and a few lucky breaks, I got promoted to the position of senior marketing executive at my company. With the pay hike, Mark and I started discussing the possibility of moving out into a house of our own. Mark seemed almost as excited as I was. "Sophia, we could finally have our own space. I know it's been tough with my parents." I looked at him skeptically. "Do you really think they'll let us go that easily?" He paused. "Well, it's our life, right? They'll have to understand." Fueled by this newfound sense of possibility, we started house hunting. After weeks of searching, we found it, a beautiful, spacious home worth $1 million. It had everything we ever wanted: large bedrooms, a garden, and even a little nook where I imagined setting up my reading corner. We were touring the house when I received a text from Jane. "Where are you two? Dinner is getting cold." I showed Mark the message. "See, they still want to control us." Mark sighed. "Once we have our own house, all this will change. You'll see." We took the plunge and bought the house. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. We moved in, filling our home with love, furniture that we picked out together. And yes, all of my clutter from the basement of my in-laws' home. It was a haven, a sanctuary from the oppressive environment I had been living in. At first, life was blissful. No more snide comments, no more endless chores. Mark seemed happier too, finally free from the relentless tension that permeated his parents' house. But the illusion of freedom shattered when just 2 months into our life in the new home, we heard a knock on the door. It was Jane and Roger, suitcases in hand. "Sophia, Mark, we've been thinking," Jane began, her tone deceptively sweet. "This house is much too big for just the two of you. It only makes sense for us to move in." I felt my blood run cold. "You want to move in?" Roger spoke up. "We're family, Sophia." I looked at Mark, who appeared to be struggling internally. Finally, he spoke. "Well, if you think it's for the best, Mom, Dad." My heart plummeted. They moved in, and almost immediately, the old patterns re-emerged. The critiques, the chores, the thinly veiled insults. It was as if we'd never left. The only difference was that this was my house, a place that should have been my sanctuary. "We bought this house," I argued one night, after a particularly grueling day. "But we're helping you manage it," Jane retorted. "In fact, I think it's best if you sign it over to us. We know better how to handle a property of this value." Mark stayed quiet, not meeting my eyes. That's when I knew. If I wanted to reclaim my freedom, my sanctuary, I'd have to fight for it. And fight I would. Lying in bed that night, I realized I'd reached a breaking point. No longer would I play the docile daughter-in-law, succumbing to their oppressive demands. It was time for a drastic change, one way or another. And so, as the dark night loomed outside my window, plans started forming in my mind. I wasn't sure what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. The old Sophia was gone. The new one was ready for battle. The tension in the house was palpable, a thick fog that settled over everything, darkening even the sunniest rooms. My every move was scrutinized, my every action criticized, yet something had changed in me. Every insult and every demeaning task became fuel for the fire that was slowly but steadily building within me. One evening, I was in the kitchen, peeling potatoes for a stew. My hands moved robotically, my mind elsewhere, weighing the options I had left. Divorce, legal action. As I pondered these life-altering choices, Jane waltzed in, a condescending smile on her face. "Sophia, we've been talking," she began, referring, as always, to her and Roger as a singular entity. "We've decided that it's high time you sign over the house to us. We're older and wiser, and we can manage the finances much better than you, youngsters, can." My grip tightened around the knife. "Is that so? And what do Mark and I get in return?" "Oh, you get to live here, of course," she said, as if she was granting me a massive favor. "Under our roof, our rules." "Jane, this is my house, and I've had enough. It's time for all of you to leave," I finally snapped. I could see her eyes widen with shock, then narrow into slits. "How dare you speak to me like that?" With a quick, fluid motion that belied her age, Jane raised her hand and slapped me across the face. A sharp pain radiated from my cheek, and when I touched it, I could already feel the skin swelling. A bruise would soon follow. "You will not disrespect me in my own son's home!" Jane shrieked. But the physical assault had a galvanizing effect on me. It was as if the fog had lifted, and I could see the situation for what it truly was. Intolerable. I locked eyes with her. "No, Jane. This ends now. This is my house, and it's you who has disrespected me for the last time." Mark, who had been a silent observer until now, finally stepped in. But I cut him off. "Save it, Mark. Your time for choosing sides was long ago, and you chose wrong." That night, I slept in a separate bedroom. The physical distance was nothing compared to the emotional chasm that had opened up between me and the family I had once been so eager to join. I called in sick at work the next day and spent the morning at a lawyer's office, setting into motion the legal wheels that would extricate me from this living nightmare. It was a battle, yes, but it was also a reclamation. I was claiming back my life, my home, and my dignity. The bruises, both physical and emotional, would heal in time, but there was one thing that would never recover: my relationship with Mark and his parents. And so, armed with legal papers and bolstered by a newfound sense of purpose, I prepared myself for the courtroom. As I looked at myself in the mirror, the bruise on my face standing out like a dark stain, I felt not shame or fear, but determination. "Enough is enough," I whispered to my reflection. "Time to turn the tables." And with that, I stepped out of the room, the click of the door echoing the finality of my decision. There was no turning back now. It was time for justice, and it was time for revenge. The courtroom was a mix of cold sterility and weighted silence. I sat there, dressed in a tailored suit, the bruise on my cheek hidden under layers of makeup, but not forgotten. Across the aisle sat Jane, Roger, and Mark. The looks on their faces were a mix of disbelief and indignation. They still couldn't fathom that I'd had the audacity to take legal action. As the proceedings began, I felt my heart racing. "Let's get this straight, shall we?" she began, her eyes flicking between me and Mark. "This property was bought under both your names, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mark and I answered in unison. "And you, Mrs. Johnson, were physically assaulted in this property." She directed the question at me. "Yes, Your Honor. I have medical records and photographs to prove it," I said, my voice trembling slightly but determined. The judge turned to Jane. "Is this true, Mrs. Williams?" Jane hesitated, glancing at her lawyer before muttering, "I might have lost my temper. But that's no reason to take away our home." "Our home?" The judge raised an eyebrow. "I was under the impression it's not your home to begin with." "Well, we've been living there, and our son's part owner," Jane argued. "That may be, but no one has the right to enact physical violence in any home," the judge cut in, clearly losing patience. "And certainly not as a means to force someone into signing over property." Then came the part we had all been waiting for, the verdict. "Taking into account the assault and the shared ownership of the house, I hereby rule in favor of Mrs. Sophia Johnson," the judge declared. "In addition to granting the divorce, Mr. Mark Williams, Mrs. Jane Williams, and Mr. Roger Williams are to pay a compensation of $50,000 for the emotional and physical damages suffered by Mrs. Johnson." A wave of relief washed over me, as though years of built-up stress had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. Across the aisle, I saw Jane's face contort with rage, Roger's eyes filled with disbelief, and Mark looked at me as if he was seeing me for the first time. After the proceedings, Mark approached me hesitantly. "Sophia, can we talk?" I looked at him, my eyes locking onto his for a moment before I answered. "There's nothing left to talk about, Mark. You had years to stand up for me, to stand up for us. But you chose your comfort over my dignity. It's too late now." "I'm sorry, Sophia," he murmured, his eyes downcast. "So am I," I said. "Sorry that I thought love was enough. It's not. Respect and dignity have to be there too. And your family showed me none of it." With that, I turned and walked away, the clacking of my heels on the marble floor punctuating the finality of it all. Justice had been served, and revenge had been had, not through schemes or plots, but through the legal system that existed to protect people like me from the abuses of those who believed they were above it. As I stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight, I felt like I was emerging from a long, dark tunnel. My old life was over, but my new life was just beginning, a life that I would build on my own terms, without the weight of oppression and abuse. It was time for Sophia Johnson to rise from the ashes of her past. And rise I would.
Sunlight streamed through the cafe window, casting a golden hue on everything it touched. I sat there, sipping my latte, engrossed in a book. When a shadow fell over my table, I looked up to find a pair of gentle blue eyes looking back at me. "Is this seat taken?" he asked with a tentative smile. I glanced around the crowded cafe and replied, "Not anymore. Go ahead." He extended a hand. "I'm Peter. My friends ditched me last minute, and it looks like this cafe is everyone's favorite today." I shook his hand, feeling a surprising warmth. "Kathy," I introduced myself, setting my book aside. We got to talking, and the initial awkwardness faded quickly. Turns out we had mutual friends, shared interests, and an uncanny knack for finishing each other's sentences. Laughter came easily, and the hours slipped by. I've never connected with someone so quickly, Peter admitted, his eyes shining with sincerity. There's something special about you, Kathy. Blushing, I replied, the feeling is mutual. It's as if the universe planned this meeting. We exchanged numbers, and from that day, we're inseparable. Romantic dinners, long walks, movie nights, and even mundane grocery trips were transformed into adventures. Our love was the kind you read about in fairy tales, full of passion and genuine understanding. One evening, after a picnic under the stars, Peter looked deep into my eyes. Kathy, he began, his voice trembling, I've never felt like this about anyone. I don't want to imagine a life without you. I felt a lump forming in my throat, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words. Before I could respond, he knelt on one knee, holding out a small velvet box. Kathy, will you marry me? Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded, yes, Peter, 1,000 times yes. And thus began our journey towards forever, but little did I know that a storm was brewing, one that would challenge the very foundation of our love. The preparations for the wedding began with a flurry of excitement. We were determined to make it the most memorable event, a true reflection of our love. Dates were chosen, venues booked, and invitations sent out. Look at this dress, Kathy, exclaimed my best friend Lisa, holding up an elegant white gown with intricate lace detailing. I tried it on, and as I looked at my reflection, I felt like a true princess. It's perfect, I whispered, my eyes misting over. Lisa smiled. Peter won't be able to take his eyes off you. The day finally arrived. The sun shone brilliantly, casting a golden aura over the quaint chapel we had chosen. Roses lined the aisles, their fragrance mingling with the scent of excited anticipation in the air. As I walked down the aisle, the world blurred around me, and all I could see was Peter looking dapper in his suit, his eyes moist with emotion. You look breathtaking, he whispered as I reached him. I squeezed his hand, only for you. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with vows of eternal love and commitment. As we exchanged rings, I felt the weight of the promise, a bond that was meant to last a lifetime. But amidst the joy, a cold shadow lurked. Sylvia, Peter's mother, sat in the front row. Her pale blue dress contrasted sharply with her icy demeanor. Every time our eyes met, I felt a chill. While everyone cheered and clapped, her applause was slow, deliberate, and almost sarcastic. During the reception, as Peter and I were swaying to our first dance, Lisa leaned in. Ignore her, Kathy. Today's about you and Peter. I'm trying, I whispered back. But why can't she be happy for us? Before she could reply, Sylvia cut in, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. May I have a dance with my son? Taken aback, Peter hesitated for a split second before nodding. Of course, Mom. As they danced, I could see Sylvia whispering into Peter's ear, her eyes darting towards me occasionally with a hint of malice. I felt a pang of unease but tried to shake it off, not wanting to let it taint our special day. Later that evening, as we were leaving, Peter pulled me close. Don't let her get to you, he murmured. I sighed. I just wish she'd give us a chance. He kissed my forehead. She will in time. We have our whole lives ahead of us. But little did we know that Sylvia's cold shadows would soon become an all too familiar part of our lives. The house I grew up in held a special place in my heart. Filled with childhood memories, it echoed with laughter, secrets, and dreams. I was thrilled when Peter and I decided to move in and turn it into our marital home. We spent days painting walls, deciding on colors that reflected both our personalities. While I loved muted pastels, Peter had a thing for bold shades. After a playful argument, we settled on a deep blue for our bedroom. I can't believe we're fighting over paint, I giggled as Peter mockingly brandished the paintbrush at me. He winked, just getting practice for the years to come. We bought furniture together, turning each shopping trip into a date, complete with ice cream stops and playful bickering. At night, we'd lie on our new couch, mapping out our future. I see us with a couple of kids running around causing chaos. Peter would muse. I'd smile, adding, and maybe a dog or two. Our days were filled with love and laughter, a warm bubble protecting us from the world outside. But that bubble was frequently punctured by Sylvia's unexpected visits. One afternoon, as I was arranging flowers, there was a sharp knock. I opened the door to find Sylvia holding a casserole dish. Her eyes scanned our living room with a hint of disdain. "I thought I'd bring you some homemade lasagna," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm sure it's better than anything you might have made." "Taken aback," I replied. "Thank you, Sylvia. That's thoughtful." But as she left, she whispered, "Take care of my boy. He's used to a certain standard." While I earned well working at a reputed company, Peter's earnings were modest. I never minded the income difference. What mattered was our love. However, Sylvia took every opportunity to remind me of my duties as a wife. One evening, as Peter and I were discussing finances, he looked worried. I brushed a strand of hair behind his ear. "Don't worry. We're a team. We'll figure it out." But his eyes were distant. I just wish I could contribute more. Feeling a surge of protectiveness, I said, "Peter, your worth isn't defined by your paycheck. We're in this together." But old resentments and Sylvia's constant interference cast shadows over our blissful beginnings, creating cracks in our once solid foundation. The months sped by and life took on a routine. Mornings were spent in a rush, with breakfasts hastily eaten and kisses quickly exchanged. Evenings were our solace, a chance to reconnect. Yet, our hard work started to pay off. Slowly but surely, our combined savings grew, largely due to my higher income. One day, while skimming through a magazine, I stumbled upon an advertisement for a stunning villa nestled by the lakeside. "Peter, look at this," I said excitedly, pointing at the glossy image. He leaned in, his eyes widening in appreciation. "Wow, that's gorgeous. But can we?" I nodded. "With our savings and a little more effort, we can make this our home." And so, the dream took root. Days were spent in planning, nights in dreaming. The dream finally materialized when we moved into our villa, the glinting lake, visible from our bedroom window. The evening we moved in, we celebrated with a simple dinner on our balcony, the soft lull of the waves providing a serene background. To new beginnings, Peter toasted, raising his glass. To love and dreams, I added, clinking my glass with his. But the serenity was short-lived. Just a week later, an unexpected knock rattled our morning. Sylvia stood at our door, her luggage in tow. "Peter," she began, her voice quivering theatrically. "I've sold the house. I thought, what better place to spend my years than with my only son?" I exchanged a panicked look with Peter. He hesitated, then replied, "Mom, you could have discussed this with us first." She shot me a quick, cold glance. I didn't think I needed permission to stay with my family. Biting back a retort, I tried to mediate, "Sylvia. It's not about permission. We just weren't expecting this." But it was evident. Sylvia had made up her mind. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments. While Peter seemed hesitant but resigned, I felt like a guest in my own home. Sylvia took over the house, criticizing my choices from decor to dinner menus. "This is not how I raised my son to live," she'd often comment. One evening, after a particularly scathing remark about my cooking, I confronted Peter. "She's making our life miserable. We need to talk to her." Peter, looking torn, replied, "Kathy, she's old. I can't just ask her to leave." "But this is our home too, Peter. We deserve to be happy." He sighed. "Give it some time. Maybe she'll come around." But deep down, I knew Sylvia's presence was not just an intrusion. It was a threat to our marriage. The magnificent villa that was once a symbol of our dreams and accomplishments soon transformed into a suffocating cage. With Sylvia's constant presence, every room echoed with her unsolicited advice and sharp remarks. One morning, as I prepared breakfast, Sylvia ambled into the kitchen, eyeing the omelet on the pan. "Is that how you cook? No wonder Peter has lost weight." Exasperated, I retorted, "He hasn't lost weight, and he likes my cooking." She sneered, "In this house, standards have surely changed." Peter, hearing the commotion, walked in. Before he could say anything, Sylvia continued her tirade. "Your wife needs to learn to take care of a house. Maybe if she focused less on work and more on home." "Mom, enough," Peter interrupted, his voice strained. Sylvia shot him a hurt look. "I'm just looking out for you." The days became a repetitive cycle of arguments and cold silences. My once beloved home now felt alien, its walls closing in on me. Sylvia's favorite pastime became lounging on our plush sofa, watching soap operas at a blaring volume, and summoning me for the smallest of tasks. One evening, as I returned from a particularly grueling day at work, I found her sprawled on the couch, a mess of wrappers around her. "Kathy," she drawled without looking up, "get me a cup of tea, will you? And clean this place up. It's a pigsty." Biting back tears of frustration, I responded, "Maybe if you helped around a bit, the house would be cleaner." She laughed, a mocking sound. "Why? That's what you're here for." That night, unable to sleep, I confronted Peter. "I can't do this anymore. I feel trapped in my own house. Your mother treats me like a servant." Peter rubbed his temples. "I know it's hard, Kathy, but she's my mother. I can't just abandon her." I felt a sharp sting of betrayal. "And what about us, Peter? What about our marriage?" He looked away, his voice barely a whisper. "She's just an old lady, Kathy. Can't you just tolerate her?" Tolerate. The word echoed mockingly. The man I loved, the one who once stood by me, was now asking me to endure the nightmare his mother was inflicting. My heart heavy with the weight of unspoken words and stifled emotions, I realized that the dream was rapidly turning into a nightmare. The sun began its descent, casting a golden hue over the villa, but inside, the atmosphere was far from warm. Every morning I would wake up hoping for a better day, but each day mirrored the last. A relentless cycle of disputes, disdain, and discontentment. The beautiful abode that once symbolized hope, love, and aspirations now felt like a cold, gilded cage. I would often find solace in the villa's garden, tending to the roses and lilies, the gentle scent serving as a brief escape. As I pruned and watered, I pondered on the blooming and withering of relationships. My marriage, which once blossomed with love and promise, now seemed to be wilting under the oppressive shadow of Sylvia's presence. On that fateful evening, I sat in the heart of our luxurious living room, the soft glow from the chandelier illuminating the elegant decor, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. The house was silent, save for the distant sounds of Sylvia's TV echoing from her room. Memories of happier times flashed before me, shared laughs, whispered secrets, and dreams woven together. It felt like a lifetime ago. When the front door clicked open, I straightened up, steeling myself. Peter walked in, looking exhausted. His tie was slightly askew, his hair tousled, signs of another taxing day at the office. However, the sight that awaited him, me, sitting sternly with a steely resolve, seemed to drain the remaining color from his face. "Kathy," his voice wavered, filled with a mix of surprise and apprehension. Taking a deep breath, I mustered the courage to speak, "Peter. We need to address the elephant in the room." His brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" "Our marriage, Peter," I began, my voice quivering despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "It's falling apart, and unless we confront it, we're headed for a disaster." He looked taken aback. Is this about Mom? Yes and no, I responded, trying to gather my thoughts. While Sylvia's behavior and your inability to address it is a significant part, it's also about us. We've allowed external factors to drive a wedge between us. We're no longer the team we once were. Peter sank into the chair opposite me, his face etched with concern. Kathy, I love you. And yes, I admit I've been torn between my love for you and my duty towards my mother. I shook my head, a bitter smile playing on my lips. Peter, love is about making choices. And every day, with every action and inaction, you've chosen her over our marriage. He looked devastated, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I never intended to hurt you. I thought we could make it work. And that's the problem, I retorted, my voice rising in frustration. Hope is not a strategy. We needed action, understanding, compromise. But all I've seen is your reluctance to address the issue and your expectation for me to constantly adjust. He took a deep, shuddering breath. What do you want, Kathy? Gathering my resolve, I spoke. I've decided to leave, Peter. I can't and won't continue living in this toxic environment. Peter looked shattered. You can't mean that. There must be a way. But I had made up my mind. It's time we face the reality, Peter. We've drifted apart. Your choices have consequences, and now it's time for me to make mine. That night was one of the longest in my life. The villa's grandeur stood mocking, the vast rooms echoing the emptiness inside me. However, amidst the pain, a spark of determination ignited. I was resolute to regain control of my life, to teach Peter and Sylvia that I was not someone to be trifled with. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal appointments, paperwork, and confrontations. The villa, which was primarily purchased with my earnings, became the epicenter of the legal battle. But beyond property and assets, it was about respect, recognition, and retribution. Every evening after work, I would find myself in the office of Mrs. Hargrove, a seasoned attorney known for her fierce advocacy for her clients. She was a petite woman, but her presence was formidable. With each meeting, we meticulously built our case, piece by piece. One day, while sifting through some documents, Mrs. Hargrove looked up, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. Kathy, are you absolutely sure about this? The path you're choosing isn't easy. I met her gaze, determination burning in my eyes. I've been pushed around and taken for granted long enough. It's time to set things right. A hint of a smile tugged at her lips. Very well. Let's get to work. The courtroom was a place of high tension. On one side, Peter, looking worn and frazzled, stood with his lawyer. Sylvia, trying to maintain her usual haughty demeanor, sat beside him. But every so often, I would catch a glimpse of fear in her eyes. On my side, Mrs. Hargrove and I were a united front, ready to face the storm. As the proceedings went on, it became evident that the odds were in my favor. I had not only contributed the lion's share to the villa's purchase, but I also had the documentation and evidence to prove it. During one of the breaks, Peter approached me, desperation evident in his demeanor. Kathy, he began, his voice quivering, isn't there another way? Can't we find a middle ground? I looked at him, my heart heavy with a mix of pity and sadness. Peter, we had all the time in the world to find a middle ground. You chose not to. Sylvia, overhearing our conversation, chimed in, her voice dripping with disdain. You always were a selfish girl, Kathy, trying to take away a roof from an old woman's head. I turned to face her, my voice cold. I gave you a home when I didn't have to. It's you who chose to make it unbearable for me. The final verdict was a crushing blow to Peter and Sylvia. The court ruled in my favor, recognizing my primary ownership of the villa. The house I had grown up in was also legally mine. As the reality sank in, Sylvia's facade crumbled. Where will we go? She cried out, her voice filled with genuine fear for the first time. Peter, looking defeated, whispered, "We'll figure it out, Mom." As for me, it was a bittersweet victory. I had regained my home, but at the cost of a relationship I once held dear. The mansion stood tall and proud, but inside, its corridors echoed with memories of love, laughter, and now loss. Months went by, and the dust of the courtroom battle settled. Life took on a new rhythm, and I immersed myself in work and the process of rebuilding, until one day, fate had one more twist in store. Walking back from work, my heels clicking on the pavement, I saw a figure huddled by the roadside. As I drew closer, a familiar face looked up, eyes vacant and defeated. Peter. Our eyes met, a plethora of emotions crossing between us: pain, regret, loss. But I walked on, choosing silence over words. The chapter was closed, and it was time to move on.
The sun peeked through the curtains, casting a warm glow on the room. It was the morning of my dream wedding, and excitement mixed with nervousness bubbled within me. I gazed at myself in the mirror, adorned in a beautiful white gown, feeling like a princess straight out of a fairy tale. As the minutes ticked away, my bridesmaids bustled around, helping me with the finishing touches. My best friend, Sarah, smiled at me warmly. "Cassandra, you look absolutely stunning." Mark is going to be blown away when he sees. I blushed, grateful for the support and love surrounding me. "Thank you, Sarah. I can't believe this day is finally here." Once we arrived at the venue, I could hardly contain my excitement. The lush gardens were adorned with flowers of every color, and the aisle was lined with petals. As I walked down the aisle, all eyes were on me, but my gaze was locked on Mark, standing at the altar looking dashing in his tuxedo. As the ceremony began, our vows were filled with promises of love and devotion. I couldn't help but smile at the thought of spending the rest of my life with him. When the moment came to exchange rings, Mark's eyes gleamed with happiness as he slipped the ring on my finger. "I promise to love you, cherish you, and support you for all the days of my life," Mark said, his voice filled with sincerity. Tears of joy welled up in my eyes, and I echoed his words, "I promise to stand by you, no matter what challenges come our way." With the exchange of rings and the pronouncement of husband and wife, the crowd erupted into applause. Our first kiss as a married couple was met with cheers and laughter. It truly felt like a dream come true. At the reception, the hall was decked out in elegance, and the atmosphere was filled with laughter and love. As we danced our first dance as husband and wife, Mark whispered in my ear, "You are the love of my life, Cassandra. I am the luckiest man in the world, and you are mine, Mark." "Today has been everything I ever hoped for," I replied, my heart overflowing with happiness. Our wedding was a magical day, a celebration of love and the beginning of our journey together. Little did I know that despite the grandeur of the day, challenges awaited, and not all our relatives were as thrilled about our union as we were. But for now, I chose to revel in the joy and love surrounding us, holding tightly to the belief that love conquers all. After the enchanting wedding day, reality began to settle in, and I couldn't ignore the underlying tension between my mother-in-law and me. Her disapproval was palpable, and it manifested in the subtlest of ways. The warmth and joy I had felt on my wedding day now seemed distant as I navigated my new life as Mark's wife. One evening, we gathered for a family dinner at my in-laws' house. As I prepared the table with the utmost care, I caught my mother-in-law's stern gaze fixed upon me. I tried to ignore it, hoping the moment would pass, but it didn't. "Cassandra, dear, do be careful with the china. It's a family heirloom," she said coldly, her eyes piercing through me. "Of course, I'll be careful," I replied, trying to mask my unease with a smile. Throughout the meal, she made snide remarks and disparaging comments, always reminding me that I was not up to her standards. My father-in-law and husband remained silent, seemingly accustomed to her behavior. It felt like I was being tested and found wanting in her eyes. I confided in my husband about my concerns, hoping he would understand my perspective. Sitting on the couch, I looked into his eyes, searching for understanding. "Mark, your mother seems to dislike me. Is there anything I can do to change that?" He glanced at me and sighed, seemingly dismissive of my worries. "Oh, don't pay too much attention to her. She's always like that. Just ignore it and get over it," he said casually, as if her behavior was insignificant. His response hurt more than I expected. I felt like he wasn't taking my feelings seriously, and it was as if he didn't see the pain his mother's coldness caused me. But I didn't want to cause any further tension between them, so I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. As weeks turned into months, the chilly atmosphere persisted. My mother-in-law's criticisms extended beyond just me. She would often belittle my choices or opinions, making me feel small and inadequate. I longed for my husband to stand up for me, but he seemed unwilling to confront his mother. One day, after an especially difficult interaction with her, I mustered up the courage to speak to him again. "Mark, I can't pretend anymore. Your mother's behavior is affecting me deeply. I need your support." He looked at me with a hint of frustration. "Why are you making such a big deal out of it? It's just how she is. You're my wife, and I love you, but I can't change her." Those words cut deep, and I felt a growing distance between us. It was disheartening to realize that my husband wasn't willing to defend me against his mother's hurtful actions. The tension in our relationship increased, and I couldn't help but wonder if his loyalty to his mother would always come before our marriage. As the days turned into weeks, I grappled with my feelings, torn between my love for Mark and the constant emotional strain his mother's disapproval brought. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a more significant challenge that lay ahead. A challenge that would test my strength and resolve in ways I couldn't have imagined. Life in my husband's parents' house became increasingly difficult as I tried to navigate the icy waters of my mother-in-law's disapproval. Not only did I have to deal with her constant criticism, but I also found myself burdened with all the household responsibilities while she and the rest of the family seemed to do nothing. One evening, I returned home from work, exhausted and looking forward to some respite. However, as soon as I stepped inside, my mother-in-law's voice echoed through the house. "Cassandra, there you are. The floors need scrubbing and the dishes are piling up in the sink. Get to it." I tried to hide my disappointment, hoping that one day she would show even a glimmer of kindness. "Sure, I'll take care of it," I replied, mustering a faint smile. This turned into weeks, and I found myself cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the household chores, all while working a full-time job. It was an exhausting routine, and I began to feel like an unpaid maid in my own home. My husband, on the other hand, seemed unfazed by the unequal distribution of labor. One evening, when he saw me washing dishes after dinner, he called out, "Hey, don't forget to iron my shirt for tomorrow. I need it crisp and perfect." I looked at him, trying to hide my frustration. "Sure, I'll get to it," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. As I ironed his shirt later that night, I couldn't help but wonder if he saw me as anything other than a housekeeper. Our conversations were becoming more distant, and it seemed like the only time he spoke to me was to assign me tasks. One day, my best friend Sarah visited, and we spent some time in the backyard, away from the prying eyes of my in-laws. She noticed the exhaustion in my eyes and gently asked, "Cassandra, are you okay? This can't be easy for you." I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and sadness that someone noticed my struggles. "Honestly, Sarah, it's hard. I feel like an outsider here, and I'm tired of being treated like I don't belong." She placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You deserve better, Cassandra. You shouldn't have to endure this. Have you talked to Mark about how you feel?" I sighed, realizing that my attempts to discuss my feelings with Mark had fallen on deaf ears. "I have, but he just tells me to ignore it and get over it. I don't think he understands how hurtful this is for me." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "You deserve a partner who supports you, not just in words, but in actions. You shouldn't have to bear the brunt of their expectations alone." Her words struck a chord with me, and I realized that I couldn't continue like this. I needed to find my voice and stand up for myself. It was time to have a serious conversation with Mark about our living situation and the emotional toll it was taking on me. As I gathered the courage to confront my husband and make him understand the depth of my pain, I knew that it was crucial for our relationship and my own well-being. Little did I know that my decision would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately lead me down a path I never imagined. As the days passed, the weight of living under my in-laws' roof grew heavier, and I could no longer ignore the strain it put on my marriage. I knew I needed to have a serious conversation with Mark about our living situation and the emotional toll it was taking on me. One evening, I sat Mark down in our bedroom, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. Mark, we need to talk about our living situation. I can't continue like this, I said firmly but gently. He looked at me, seemingly surprised by the seriousness in my tone. What do you mean, Cassandra? I mean, living with your parents is affecting our relationship, and I feel like an outsider in my own home. Your mother's constant criticism and the unequal distribution of household responsibilities are taking a toll on me, I explained, trying to articulate the extent of my frustration. Mark sighed, looking conflicted. I know it's not ideal, but we need to save money to buy our own place. I understand that, but we also need to find a balance. I can't be the only one taking care of everything while they do nothing, I asserted, hoping he would see the strain it was putting on our marriage. I'll talk to my parents about it, Mark said, but his words lacked conviction. The next day, Mark talked to his parents about sharing the household responsibilities more equally. To my surprise, they reluctantly agreed, and for a brief period, things improved slightly. However, the underlying tension between my mother-in-law and me still remained, and it was clear that she was not happy about the change. During this time, we continued to save money, and eventually we found a big house that we could call our own. It was an exciting prospect, and I hoped that moving into our new home would signify a fresh start for our marriage. As the day of our move-in approached, we decided to have a housewarming party to celebrate this significant milestone. I eagerly made plans and sent out invitations to our friends and family, hoping that this event would bring us all closer together. The day before the party, I returned home from work with a sense of excitement, eager to finalize the preparations. But as I stepped inside, the house was eerily quiet, and I sensed that something was amiss. "Hello, is anyone here?" I called out, but there was no response. I walked through the rooms, feeling increasingly uneasy. And then it hit me. They had all gone to the new house without me. The realization was like a punch to the gut, and tears welled up in my eyes. I felt hurt and betrayed. Holding back my emotions, I quickly made my way to our new house, where I found everyone gathered, laughing and celebrating without me. I confronted my mother-in-law, trying to keep my voice steady. Why wasn't I invited to the housewarming party? She looked at me with a cold smile. Oh, we didn't think there was any reason to invite the cleaning lady. This is a family gathering. The words stung, and my heart sank. I turned to Mark, hoping for some support, but he laughed along with his mother, as if my hurt didn't matter. It was in that moment that I realized I couldn't continue like this. I had endured enough mistreatment, and I knew it was time to take a stand. A surge of determination washed over me, and I made a decision that would change everything. Feeling hurt and betrayed by my mother-in-law's callous words and my husband's laughter, I fought back tears and tried to maintain my composure. Deep down, I knew that this moment was a turning point in our relationship. "You think this is a joke?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. "I am your wife, not just a cleaning lady. I deserve to be treated with respect and included in our own housewarming party." My mother-in-law's expression remained cold and indifferent. "You may be married to my son, but that doesn't make you one of us." Her words were like a dagger to my heart. I had hoped that, over time, she would come to accept and embrace me as a part of their family. But it was clear that her prejudice ran deep. I turned to Mark, hoping he would step up and defend me, but his silence spoke volumes. His lack of support felt like a betrayal, a painful realization that he was unwilling to stand up for me against his family. "Mark, say something?" I pleaded, my voice choked with emotion. He hesitated for a moment, but then he shook his head. "Mom, she's my wife, and she should be treated with respect. She has every right to be a part of our celebrations." His mother's eyes narrowed, and she shot him a disapproving glare. "You're making a mistake, Mark. She doesn't belong here." I felt a sinking feeling in my chest as I realized that even my husband couldn't break free from his mother's influence. The family dynamics were much more complicated than I had initially thought. In that moment, I knew I had to make a difficult decision. I couldn't continue living in a toxic environment, constantly feeling like an outsider. It was time to take control of my life and assert my worth. "I've had enough," I said firmly, wiping away the tears that threatened to spill. "I won't subject myself to this treatment any longer." My mother-in-law scoffed, crossing her arms. "What are you going to do, leave? You have nowhere else to go." That was the final straw. I had endured enough emotional abuse, and I couldn't let it continue. Summoning my courage, I spoke with a newfound determination. Actually, I do have somewhere else to go. I had been quietly saving money, and with the help of my best friend Sarah, I had found a small apartment that I could afford. It wasn't ideal, but it was a step towards my independence and happiness. I am leaving, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I deserve to be treated with kindness and respect, and I won't settle for anything less. Mark's face contorted with shock, and he finally found his voice. Cassandra, wait, let's talk about this. But I knew there was nothing left to discuss. I had tried to make things work, but I couldn't keep sacrificing my self-respect for the sake of a marriage that felt one-sided. No, Mark, I can't stay in a place where I am constantly belittled and disrespected. I deserve better than this, I declared, my heart breaking as I walked away from the house, leaving behind the life I had once dreamt of. As I drove away, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. I had made a difficult choice, but it was the right one for my well-being. Little did I know that this decision would set off a chain of events that would lead to an unexpected outcome, one that would challenge me to stand strong and find the strength to build a new life without the toxicity that had held me back for so long. Leaving behind the house and the toxic environment was both liberating and terrifying. As I settled into my new apartment, I knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in my life. One where I would no longer be controlled by my in-laws' disapproval and my husband's indifference. In the days that followed, I focused on healing and finding my strength. I realized that I had been giving my all to a relationship that wasn't reciprocated. It was time to take charge of my life and assert my worth. One evening, as I sat with Sarah in my new living room, I shared my thoughts with her. Sarah, I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. I need to protect myself and move forward. She nodded, her eyes filled with compassion. You're doing the right thing, Cassandra. It's not easy, but you deserve to be happy. As I thought about my next steps, an idea began to take shape. I had been the one financially supporting our life together, and my mother-in-law had signed the house over to me without a second thought. Perhaps this could be the key to breaking free completely. I decided to have a conversation with my mother-in-law, but this time I would be the one in control. With a sense of determination, I called her and requested a meeting. A few days later, we sat across from each other in a coffee shop. She looked expectantly at me, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing inside me. What do you want, Cassandra? She asked, her tone dismissive. I want to talk about the house, I replied firmly. Since you signed it over to me, I've been thinking about what to do with it. She raised an eyebrow, clearly curious about my intentions, and what do you plan to do? I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. I want you and the rest of the family to move out. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips formed a tight line. You can't be serious? I am. You made it clear that I don't belong in your family, so it's time to accept that and move on, I said, my voice steady despite the nerves that threatened to overwhelm me. You think we'll just leave our home because you say so? She scoffed. It's not your home anymore, I replied, feeling a sense of empowerment building within me. You signed it over to me. Remember? I can do whatever I want with it. She glared at me, clearly frustrated by my determination. Fine. Take this junk and get out of our lives. As I walked away from the meeting, I knew that this was just the first step of my plan. I would need to seek legal advice to ensure that I could make this transition as smooth as possible. My goal was to sever all ties with the toxic family I had married into and start anew. With the help of a lawyer, I navigated the legal process of removing my in-laws from the house. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. But I reminded myself that this was about reclaiming my life and my happiness. As the court proceedings continued, my mother-in-law's true colors were exposed. She tried to manipulate the situation, painting herself as a victim. But I stood my ground, knowing that I couldn't let her continue to control my life. Eventually, the court ruled in my favor, and I became the sole owner of both houses. The old one where my ex-husband and his family were still living, and the new one that I had purchased. With the divorce finalized and my independence secured, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I knew that this was the right decision, and I was ready to move forward without the weight of a toxic relationship holding me back. As I stepped into my new house, the one that was truly mine, I felt a sense of accomplishment and pride. I had overcome the hurtful betrayal and taken control of my life. It was time to embrace this new beginning and build a life filled with love, respect, and the happiness I deserved. With the divorce finalized and the houses now in my name, I knew I had taken a step towards true freedom. It was both empowering and bittersweet, as I had to let go of the dreams I once had for my marriage. But it was also the beginning of a new chapter, one where I could build a life on my terms, free from toxicity and hurtful relationships. One day after the court proceedings, I received a call from my ex-mother-in-law. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but I decided to confront the situation head-on. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice firm. Her voice trembled, a hint of desperation seeping through. "Cassandra, please forgive me. We've lost everything and we have nowhere to go. Can't we just put this behind us and move on?" I took a deep breath, reminded myself of the years of hurt and mistreatment I endured. "You had your chance to treat me with kindness and respect, but you chose not to. Now you have to live with the consequences of your actions." "I know I was wrong," she pleaded, her tone seemingly sincere. "Please let us stay with you. We have nowhere else to go." I hesitated for a moment, torn between the part of me that wanted to be compassionate and the part that knew she had shown no remorse until now. But I knew that giving in would only perpetuate the cycle of toxicity. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. You made your choices, and now you have to face the consequences," I replied firmly, ending the call. It was a difficult decision, but I knew that allowing them back into my life would only lead to more pain and manipulation. I had to prioritize my well-being and find the strength to move forward. As time passed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I turned the old house, the one they were still living in, into a rental property, ensuring that I could secure my financial independence and start fresh. With the money I earned from the rental, I invested in myself, pursuing new hobbies and even considering furthering my education. One evening, I received an unexpected visit from my ex-husband. I was taken aback, unsure of his intentions. "Cassandra, I need to talk to you," he said, looking earnest. I motioned for him to sit, feeling a mix of apprehension and curiosity. "What is it, Mark?" "I know I messed up," he began, his eyes filled with regret. "I should have stood up for you and treated you better. I'm sorry for not being there when you needed me." I listened to his words, realizing that they held more weight than any apology he had given before. But I also knew that actions spoke louder than words. "I appreciate your apology, Mark, but it's not enough," I said, mustering the courage to speak my truth. "I can't forget the years of mistreatment and your lack of support. I need to move on and find happiness without you." He looked down, seemingly accepting my words. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I regret the way things turned out." As he left, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. It was painful to see the person I once loved with such intensity, but I knew that staying tied to a toxic relationship would only hold me back. In the months that followed, I embraced my newfound independence. I surrounded myself with supportive friends and focused on building a life filled with love, joy, and self-fulfillment. As I settled into my new home, the one I had bought with my hard-earned money, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. I had overcome a hurtful betrayal and found the strength to stand up for myself. Looking back, I realized that seeking justice wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life and my happiness. I had learned the value of self-respect and the importance of letting go of toxic relationships. With the weight of the past lifted, I was finally free to embrace the future with hope and optimism. This was my triumph, and I was ready to embrace the journey ahead, knowing that I had the strength to face